introduce Dr. Omid Naim.
So I was really honored when you invited me to do this talk because I'm a big supporter of psychedelics. I personally have had, I think it kind of saved my life in many ways, starting 15 years ago with MDMA at Burning Man and kind of waking up to how asleep I was. And I've done a lot of work with ayahuasca, done a lot of work with all the psychedelics. But I'm also an integrative child and adult and child psychiatrist. And I'll tell you a little bit about my story, but I'm a real believer in them as part of a larger picture. And so I was eager to do this talk to try and make a case for the psychedelic community kind of seeing itself maybe in a bigger picture, integrating into a model in healthcare, and because I think it can go further that way. But also not just as a medicine, but actually as a way to shift society as a whole. And that's my thing, is to really think about mental health actually as kind of the apex. That one thing we say about Lamaita is that it's a communal, and we're proposing a communal and spiritual approach to mental health. And that's just the way it always used to be, is that prior to modern times, mental health was seen as something that happened through spirituality and through community. Mm. And it was really the apex of how we stayed well was through these integrative experiences and integrative practices. And to try and put psychedelics within that framework is my goal. So, next slide. What's that one? If you do the arrow. Is it on? Okay. Actually, is it?
Press pause or back.
There we go.
Okay. So this do that every time.
So when I do my talks, I always actually start with this slide. Because I think we're in a pretty fucked up situation at this point. I don't know how much people know the degree to which we are sick. We are very, very unwell in terms of mental health in this country. These dates correspond to when psychoactive medications began to be used. So in the 1950s with Thorazine, that's when we first started using psychoactive medications for mental health purposes. And at that point, 1 out of 500 people were disabled due to depression, anxiety. At that point, there wasn't trauma. In the 1980s, it was 1 out of 200, and that's just before the SSRIs, and modern antipsychotics began to be used. So you already see what a big jump in disability. But then that's a really rapid jump in 30 years to go from 1 out of 200 to 1 out of 76. So when I was going through medical school and residency, I did a Western general and adult and child psychiatry at UCSF. When people would talk about why people aren't getting better, the argument was that we haven't had enough time. Or when you looked at epidemiological data from other countries versus our countries, it was an issue of we're not diagnosing yet enough people. But I would really argue we've had enough time. There's really good research that shows that the medicines long-term, beyond I think a few months in terms of acute stabilization, they really do make people worse. And I'm excluding, let's say, schizophrenia and really severe versions of bipolar disorder, which you would really classify more as neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. When we're talking about depression, anxiety, PTSD, that's what the numbers tell you. With kids, the medication use is really, to me, like just unbelievable. And the rates here have jumped. And I think cell phones and internet are playing a big role in that. And I also put opiate use, which I think is a dramatic statistic. So I think there's something about our culture that we are avoiding pain. That's the big argument. And I think also the individualistic model of disease. So next slide. So these are my arguments against current mental health treatment. When I went to residency, it was really so odd that you would go into one clinic and you learn about psychopharmacology, and it was based on a chemical imbalance and genetic theory. And then you go into another clinic and you learn from analysts and psychodynamic therapists about psychodynamic theories. And then you might have to learn CBT and DBT, but nobody explained that these could actually be part of one model, which made no sense. It would be like going to a cardiologist and then going and getting a stress test and then seeing the nurse, and they're all saying there's completely different reasons why you're having heart trouble. It just makes no sense, right? So that's what I call the lack of coherence. The other thing was this idea of stability. That was the goal, that a person was supposed to become stable. So there are very good statistics and very good quotes from the head of APA and IMH in the 60s and 70s. Depression and anxiety were time limited prior to the 1980s, considered time limited. Most people were known to recover after one episode and not have another episode again. And this was known in the field. So when I went into training, this idea of recovery, like you're supposed to actually recover, is like nobody's even thinking that at all. I was trained that, beyond, like, people will have most likely second and third, and you need to keep them on medication, and that you have to balance their chemistry. And this was, people would come in and say, I'm out of balance, I need to balance my chemistry. The other big thing is we have a pathogenic study of the root cause. And I'll explain that more, but all of medicine is based on the study of disease. We don't study healthy people. We actually have this really weird idea that there's like healthy people and sick people, and they're separate populations. And then when you're healthy and become sick, now you're sick, but there's no connection between the two. And there's no preventive model. In cardiology, there's cholesterol and exercise. We don't. Our field doesn't do anything in terms of promoting health. We have a lot of self-help that's happening outside of mental health treatment, but we're not using any science to actually promote well-being, much less using that science to help sick people get healthy. And the last thing is talk therapies. So I am myself a victim of many years of talk therapy where nothing got better. And I'm not against talk therapy. I think really good talk therapy can work. But I have a general argument with top-down models. The belief that, it's a Western belief that I think, therefore I am, that my cognitive, my conscious, self-conscious self can master is I think why these things don't work. And that actually matches chemical imbalance theory. Western civilization is all based on top-down theories. Versus how really the brain actually works. And then the biggest thing is that it's individually based, that all of them share this, is that you are the problem. There's something wrong in you. Next slide. So this is the curse of humans, is hubris and reductionism. So these were great theories. These are all great theories. But it's how they're used. And that's kind of my argument to the psychedelic community, is that we can feel, I can often find people feel as if we got it, we got the elixir. This is going to change everything. And this is going to change everything, right? So it's that this is going to do it, and it's going to change everything. So it's my cautionary kind of thing is, this is what they all said. The psychoanalysts thought that they were going to change the world. The behaviorists thought they were going to change the world, right? And we can be top down about psychedelics. Next slide. So my argument is for an integrated model of health. So I studied, I did adult and child psychiatry. And I was working in most of the foster care community mental health clinics, and seeing a lot of trauma, but nobody was talking about trauma. Right now, everybody's talking about trauma, which is great. but in the early 2000s, that was actually, I would have case after case, severe abuse, severe neglect, multiple homes. The diagnosis was ADHD, bipolar disorder, oppositional defiant conduct disorder. They were on 2, 3, 4 medications. And it was just really unbelievable, the lack of common sense. The idea of trauma is kind of new, actually. Whereas when I was in my training, it was the peak of pediatric bipolar disorder being diagnosed with kids, so at some point I read Peter Levine's book, Waking the Tiger, and that really kind of cracked me open, opened me to mind-body medicine, and I studied integrative medicine. So integrative medicine integrates all valid frameworks into a single coherent model, bringing coherence and collaboration within the mental health paradigm. So integrative medicine is a field created by a guy, Andrew Weil. There's multiple programs now. Integrative psychiatry is something I'm working on developing. There's very few people doing integrative psychiatry, but my goal is to come upon a single coherent model that brings them all together. It's an argument for a holistic framework for assessment and treatment. We look at other things, the role of the person's community and relationships, the role of the environment, looking at a person's lifestyle. And I list some of these things this way because I think this is the way to think about how can we actually really change society. That if you use I think an integrated model works. We are doing research on the model in our clinic, and I can tell you that most people who go through it lead to complete recovery. Not everybody goes through it because you really have to be willing to look at everything. You got to be willing to look at your lifestyle. You got to look at your community. You got to think about, who do I really have in my life? The problem isn't in me. The problem is multidimensional. But when you assess in that multidimensional way, and people are willing to actually go through the sacrifice of looking and changing all things about themselves to become whole, what happens is you actually wind up changing your environment. You wind up changing your lifestyle. You opt out of the rat race, for instance. You start demanding clean air. You become more demanding of whole foods. So the integrative model not only, I think, works, but it actually shifts society. Because we're arguing for wholeness. We're arguing for a holistic way of life. Then I put this down here because this is kind of a motto in tribal health, which is that my health is my community's health, which is my health. Next slide. So this was the book that kind of cracked me open to mind-body medicine. And I was seeing a lot of trauma. Nobody was talking about trauma. And the idea that trauma was actually a normal state that the human being is stuck in was fascinating. The other thing that was fascinating was to learn that emotions are in the body. So I went through 4 years of medical school, 5 years of Western training, and emotions were never thought to be in the body. Everything is cognitive. It's how I think, I feel, blah, blah, blah. But like the fact that an emotion is actually just a physical reaction, that it's a mammalian innovation, that's its basic thing, right? And that trauma is a blocking of our emotion in a freeze state, that all animals, all the way back to jellyfish, actually found to have this freeze capacity. It's the third mechanism. If you can't run, and if you can't fight, you can play dead. A lot of predators don't see things moving. A lot of predators don't eat something if it's already been dead, thinking is maybe it's because it's decayed and it's poisonous at that point. So there is this freeze state. If anybody's had the experience, most people have, of watching National Geographic, there's a bunch of zebras at a watering hole. They suddenly sense the tiger or the lion, and you see they freeze for a moment, right? And if anybody's had the experience of getting past something really, really terrible, and then once you realize you survived, you shake. So that's the completion. of the frozen state. It's actually a normal part of our process is to have all three mechanisms, and then we're supposed to shake. You see animals shaking all the time. What this reminded me of was a book that you guys will see the picture in a few slides that I had read years before called The Human Zoo, that showed how, just made the basic point that humans only get mental illness in modern developed countries. No animals do, except for animals in zoos. That animals in zoos start to develop same signs of depression and anxiety, and so do pets. So no animals in the wild get depressed. But why do our dogs need Prozac, right? So that was the big question, is like what that. So what Peter Levine says is that we stay in that state, and we have an innate capacity to heal. That shake, that completion, that release is actually where we're designed for that. But we don't. Humans stay stuck in that frozen state because of certain aspects of how we think. And that stayed with me. What is it about the way we think that keeps us blocked? And Gabor Mate actually gave me that answer, which we'll get to in a few slides. But the other thing I took away from it is just that basic point that in our natural state in the wild, we are in flow, and that we don't get sick. And then the last thing was that he taught it in a way that you could teach a 7-year-old. Just like I did to you guys, really simple. And having gone through all that training and seeing people not getting better, and to think that it's actually simple, and why don't we just teach the basics of how our nervous system runs and why we get sick. So that was like a big inspiration for me. Next slide. So this is that next slide, the human zoo. And this idea that symptoms are signals of some temporary imbalance from a natural state of wholeness. The other point that the human zoo brings up is that when we were living in our tribal state, limited numbers of people, which today we could say 100 to 150 was the average size, and I'll explain why later. Cooperation and competition were not separate processes. And it's that same idea of my health is my community's health is my health. That when we are in flow in our natural state, optimal competition is optimal cooperation and vice versa. Next slide. So that idea of teaching health, the next step for me was learning about this model called Salutogenesis, study of health promotion. Aaron Antonovsky was an Israeli researcher who in the 60s and 70s was really interested in understanding why was it in Holocaust survivors there was such a discrepancy in who wound up becoming sick and broken and who survived, but not just survived, but thrived, and what was the difference. And that was what he was really interested in studying. He made some really basic points, just like the emotions are in the body thing, that, why do we not have that common sense? That disease and health are actually on one continuum, and that we should be speaking and studying disease as on the continuum of health, and see how people move on that spectrum, and looking for interventions to support people based on seeing how that change happens. Makes another really good point that in Western society, we think of health as the baseline, and even think of it as our right, and that disease is a betrayal, when in actuality, disease and decay are the natural state. First law of physics, things go to entropy, right? And that health, this life force that seems to come together over and over again and preserve continuity of life, that's that's the miracle, that's the triumph. And all the way down to this multicellular, multi-organ person, we are from birth, getting ready to die, but what is this health force? So we wanted to study that. Next slide. So health promotion, he found in the end, what he came to was it depends on environments, and specifically he meant cultures, that foster in their individuals a sense of coherence. that cultures and communities that communicate such values and beliefs and principles that instill in their individuals that when something bad happens, whether I know what it is or not, whether it's whatever, even if I know nothing, I fundamentally believe that it is comprehensible, that it is manageable, meaning even if I don't have the skills, it's something that is solved by skills. And the last one is that it's meaningful, that I'm inspired to go after solutions, right? And he believed that was the most important aspect of it, actually, is that people believe it's meaningful to become resilient, to grow, to change, to face difficulty, to face the problems with resilience. When I read that, it took a while, but at some point it hit me that Psychogenesis speaks to the oldest form of medicine, which is storytelling. Is that people, that's what we did. We would sit and tell positive, meaningful stories where you could locate yourself in experiences and go through rites of passage, knowing that I can go into the wilderness, I can go into the wild, I can go into the dark, but I will figure it out. It is figured outable, and it's important to my journey in life. And that we don't teach that anymore, right? We teach that if something bad happens to you, you got fucked up. It's how you can identify yourself is through your suffering, and you're a consumer that's supposed to be fixed, right? Very, very different. So I think we're really breeding helplessness and victimhood. Next slide. So the resilience research, this is a growing field, really bolsters this argument that there is something about modern life that's making us sick, and there's something about Western civilization that actually seems to be making us sick. That the problem is not you, it's the way in which we're living. If you look at the epidemiology, people don't get depressed and anxious like we do in Western society. And the argument that they're not being diagnosed is not true, it's not valid. These are constructs that we are actually exporting to other cultures. So people who spend time in nature, who exercise, these two are the strongest. Who knows about blue zones? So blue zones are places where people live exceptionally long. I think there's 6 or 8 of them. And they're being studied. Why do people live so long? Why do people not get sick at the high rates? They have the highest rate of older, like people over 100. So they've looked at food, exercise, all these lifestyle factors. The number one thing is community and faith and spirituality. So people believing that their most important thing is something larger than them, I think is the shared aspect of that. You see all of these, actually these 3. If you take that, the social isolation has now been studied extensively to have a bigger risk factor for mortality than cigarettes, obesity. So, and then the other thing is, emerging research on mindfulness, yoga, breath work. So if the problem was chemical imbalances, or if the problem was, if the problem was a chemical imbalance, why would 4 weeks of yoga be equivalent to an antidepressant? Why would mindfulness meditation lead to recovery from anxiety, right? So if you put it all together, to me the summary is like there's actually a natural way of living, right? It's that first argument I was making a few slides ago. There's a natural state that we don't get sick, and we're not living in that natural way. But what is that natural way, right? Next slide. So another big inspiration for me was in the field of interpersonal neurobiology. Dan Siegel's work was out at UCLA, and the groundbreaking work there is really talking about the mind as a relational function as well as an embodied one, but also making the argument that's an embodied, right? It's like getting away from the top-down theory, I think therefore I am, but it's actually breaking into the body right? But also the relational. And his argument is all parts of who we are being integrated is health. All parts being integrated, harmony, flow, right? But again, why do we become disintegrated, right? Like Peter Levine's thing, why is it we stay stuck in the frozen state? Is it how we are relating to our relationships? Next. So, this is my argument as to why we're getting sick. If you look at since the late 1800s, the Industrial Revolution, prior to that time, we were primarily outside, and we were primarily with our families. In addition to it mechanizing our experience, right? We start to think mechanical if everything becomes mechanical. Then 1950s, suburbanization, that was a huge, huge change. So the idea of the nuclear family being the norm is a total experiment, which I'm not saying it's wrong, but it is an experiment, right? That's brand new. It's something we're trying for like 70 years now. It's completely different than how everybody else, all mammals, all primates, where you are designed, we are designed to grow up expecting 10, 20 eyes looking at us from childhood that know us deeply and intimately. The pressure on a mom to be the attachment figure in the nuclear family. I mean, who has kids, right? The thing is, you're trying to fill the whole village in that house. And you want to give them space because you don't want to hover, but at the same time, you see how lonely we are in that house. So, then in the 80s, the breakdown of the nuclear family, again, not saying divorce is morally bad, but that, again, that's a huge tear in the norm. It's like suddenly, watering your plant, like 50% less. And if the leaves turn brown, do we give it brown leaf disease, right? We also, this is an interesting subject to me, like politically, or what happened, because a lot happened. Child molestation, child injury, kids suddenly are now indoors, way, way more, okay? And you remember that earlier slide, the 1950s, the 1980s, and 2013 disability rates. So there are these different things happening. We're over-medicating, we're taking away the nourishment that we were designed for, we're suppressing the signals, right? And then we're telling different stories. So Lamaita's tagline is consciousness, health, and community. We're taking away our natural health, right? We're breaking down community, and we're telling false stories. That's my big thing, is it's a story. The story we're telling makes all the difference. I can, on any given day, do an intake with somebody, I do an assessment. OCD started at age 9. A few questions down. What do you think is the cause? Well, I went to see a therapist when I was 10, and he said I have OCD, and it's probably a chemical thing, but it's stress-related, but it's a chemical. A few questions later, I asked about family. Well, my parents got divorced when I was 10. Okay. Did it suddenly? Well, they were arguing before that, right? There's all this stress in the house. Do you think they're related? No. Why don't you think they're related? Well, half my friends' parents got divorced. I was told that's normal. And again, I'm not criticizing, I'm not saying divorce is bad, but to say that it happens and it's normal and you're supposed to be okay, which then makes you not trust your own feelings. You stop listening to your own signals, right? And then the SSRIs have played a huge, huge role because we're suppressing our signals. It's like putting a cast on a broken leg and then never taking the cast off. So I call this progressive disconnection because then with technology and the internet, what we're doing is we're phasing out felt sense. as what guides us. Next slide. So ACEs is a landmark study that was done. Kaiser was the first one who did it with 17,000 people. And it really unequivocally shows how early childhood stress, neglect, and trauma is underlying most of the chronic health conditions that we're dealing with, whether it's cardiovascular stuff or whether it's mental illness. So that's that whole argument, you see, is that the way we're changing is putting severe stress and then we're developing trauma. Trauma, I think, is the root cause, as well as the suppression of feelings. Next slide. So, integrative medicine, founded by Andrew Weil at the University of Arizona. Philosophical foundation is the fundamental nature of the mind-body connection. The primary role of spirituality, religion, and healthcare, power of belief and the importance of culture, that the relationship matters the most. Rather than fixing people, we're interested in empowering people. This one I have the biggest problem with most integrative medicine people because it's kind of just turned into boutique medicine. And but people who are really doing true integrative medicine, you are teaching and you're empowering people to mostly be able to recover naturally, not trading in medicine, supplements for medicines. And central community environment and healing, as well as focus on prevention. Next slide. So my practice is called Hope Integrative Psychiatry, and what I wanted to do was integrate as many of the most valid and right models into one coherent model. So taking interpersonal neurobiology as a foundation for neuroscience, somatic theories of trauma, Bruce Perry's neurosequential model of development, ecological and evolutionary lens, which leads to this concept of wholeness, whole system sciences. Basic way of thinking about that is if you buy a plant, it's got a card and it tells you this is how much water, this is how much sun, this is what this being evolved to thrive in. So seeing human beings through that lens and creating a healthcare model through that lens. Resilience research, learning theories, etc. Next slide. So it's a multimodal team approach. Most of what I do is actually psychoeducation. Most of what I do is storytelling. Most of what I do is what I just did with you guys the last 20, 30 minutes, which is explain people's experiences through an ecological evolutionary lens. But I also use natural remedies. Very, very rarely I use medication, but most of the time limited. There's talk therapy. There's individual therapy, couples and family therapy, resilience coach, neurofeedback. We at Lamaida, we have a studio. So the idea is to empower people to build up their own skills and to do that in community. So we have our own yoga and meditation studio full of classes. We have community gathering events. We have men's groups, women's groups, dance, arts, celebration. Celebration, that's like primary in most indigenous cultures and how you keep your health care, how you bolster mental health, right? And so the idea is like, Lamaida, the idea around Lamaida is that what would, if all these things that are coming out in terms of science and research and psychedelics and, if it all was put together to the ideal clinic, what would it look like? And the idea is it would have an integrative clinic, it would have a studio, and it would also have community events and gathering and celebration. Next slide. So this is Lamaida, started in 2016. Next slide. And so I make the point here, our tagline is consciousness, health, and community. These are the three ways we've dealt with it in our society. Is that this is our culture. So that is that's the consciousness that we have been generating. Reductionism, individualism, consumerism, and materialism. Healthcare is like breaking because of chronic health conditions that are lifestyle related, actually. And then the breakdown in community. I am very proud of this. So when I finished my integrative medicine fellowship, I was still doing community mental health, and that was supposed to be my path. And I learned how to work with all these remedies and yoga, meditation. But if the county will pay $300 for an antipsychotic, but you can't recommend yoga or meditation to a foster kid if the institution isn't supporting it. So that's when I went into private practice. And actually, Lameda it's a side project. The idea was to create the model. For me, the idea was to create the model so that I can be invited into an institution. So 2 years ago, we were invited by McKinley Child Center. And we negotiated for complete institutional transformation. So we're in the middle right now of training 300 employees. They have a 28-bed residential treatment center. They have multiple outpatient clinics. They run several non-public schools. And we are designing all aspects of how their institution runs, from management style to food to space and beauty and everything based on our model, which is really amazing. We're really lucky. It's amazing, I say, because we have this amazing CEO who he benefited from integrative medicine, and he really despises how over-medicated the kids are. And he heard about the work I've done. So if this succeeds, which I know it will, we've been doing it in a pilot cottage, just teaching the staff how to sense their own feelings, not with their head, work on their own trauma, sense your own feelings, and then learn how with breath you can regulate, and how to sense what's happening in the kids before a restraint has to be put on. And within a few months, they had 0 restraints being used, when it was like once or twice a day. And they had,
Where's it located?
it's in San Dimas. Yeah. And they had staff like coming up to them from other cottages saying like, what is this stuff you guys are doing? Because your kids are like way different than our kids, just within a few months. Next slide. So the core of the model organizes around this idea of wholeness. Wholeness is an ecological term. It comes from whole system sciences. Again, it's this idea of like, if you think of a plant, you buy a plant and you know what this plant needs to thrive, and it's this idea that if it has all of its natural conditions, it will not get sick. And so through a wholeness model, what I get interested in is what is human nature. And I think from the beginning of human nature, really ever since we left the tribal state where we began to grow, and I'm going to explain that in a few slides, we've always had wisdom traditions that kept us together. And so that category of consciousness, culture, that's what shifts things. It's the stories we're telling. Think of Salutogenesis. It's the storytelling. And it's the way we stopped telling stories that had integrity to wholeness that we started to get sick. So in this model, symptoms and a crisis are actually your health emerging. It's wholeness seeking itself. And it's also the myth of the hero's journey. And I'll show you what I mean by that. And then the last thing is at Lameda, we're just now rolling it out as using council, basing it off of Native American council, but not Native American council. But the idea of creating councils in which people come together around our model to promote health, integrity, and self-actualization. Next slide. So what is wholeness? The basic idea of wholeness is completion. It's to be complete. And or self-completion. Acorn becomes the oak tree. Each individual part of the dimension is part of a whole. Right? So the cells of the heart become the heart. The heart is one organ of many organs. right? The brainstem regulates all the organs. The limbic system is connected to others, right? Our mental state is connected to culture. We interact with nature. So all these different things interconnected, interrelated. And then keeping a healthy balance and harmony between these is what it is to be whole. And in that definition, resilience is that, any new stress, any new situation, the system shifts, and then when it recovers its wholeness, that's what resilience is. So wholeness, all of life is governed by these two basic drives, self-correction and self-actualization. So self-correction, the innate capacity to heal. Those are big terms, but it's really, really basic. It's just, I go outside, it's colder outside, but I stay 98.7 degrees, right? I go into a warm room, I stay 98.7 degrees. So we have a gazillion ways in which we're just constantly self-correcting, right? It's how a single cell stays a cell. It has a capacity to keep itself whole. Now, if there's still energy left, then you can grow. And then that growth is to complete your innate potential. Again, that's a really great sounding thing, but it's really simple. Acorn becomes an oak tree, right? A seed becomes what it's supposed to be. Next slide. So, in a holistic, whole system model of health, it's an ecological model. Different dimensions. So what are the conditions that we are evolved to be whole? Next slide. So I go to the brain. It's a really, so the neurosequential model that Bruce Perry described really says a lot about our actual experience of being alive. If you break down the brain, there's a lot that happens in the brain, but it is really three big categories, okay? Our primitive brain, so let me say it this way, evolutionarily, we didn't have like bikes and cars and trains that were all invented separately like humans and reptiles, right? Evolution builds on itself. Mm-hmm. So the brain stem that we have is the same as in a reptile's, regulating the internal state in response to the external state, okay? Reptiles are purely self-regulating, whereas mammals, the innovation was the limbic system, which is this capacity to share information to coordinate behavior, okay? Relationships, love, community, the feeling of authenticity in a relationship, the feeling that I belong, all that stuff is a limbic system. And then the last is primates and humans. What really makes us human is the neocortex, the ability to think. That's what gave rise to self-consciousness, narrative, creativity, storytelling, the experience of meaning, which is story with experience, and I'll explain that. But the point of neurosequential, this point is, the brainstem is actually the fastest processor, moment to moment. The first time I did ayahuasca at your house, Scott. Sorry.
Me too. I don't do that no more.
No, the profound thing, the first profound thing was like witnessing how the narrating me is catching up with what I've already decided to do, right? But anybody who slammed on the brakes and your arm juts out, right? You didn't think about that. Your arm just did it, right? And then you said, oh, my arm just jumped out, right? Or if you're having a panic attack, you can keep saying, stop doing that, but it won't work, right? So the brainstem is actually the fastest. The reason why you can't connect with somebody if you're overwhelmed, or you can't feel connected, is because the brainstem runs things first. Then you can connect. So then the limbic system is second, and actually the neocortex, the thinking, is the last. But the neocortex is the most plastic, it's the most abstract, it's the most complex. It's the one that can change minute to minute. That's why you can change your mind 1,000 times in a minute. Brainstem is the slowest to change. That's why, so I could spend 5 minutes telling myself to stop panicking and it won't work. And then I could remember that if I do breathing techniques that slow down my brainstem, I could actually calm it down. But that'll take 2-3 minutes, right? Meanwhile, I could have gone through 1,000 different thoughts. So that neocortex is so amazing, but also so hard to manage, right? Yeah, next slide. So the physical dimension, the regulation of the internal world, that goal of that brainstem is for us to feel peace, safety, and to give us vitality so we can give it our all. The emotional side, the limbic system, what it's seeking is deep, intimate relationships. And it's felt. It's not a concept. I'm going to get to a slide of horses in a minute, and I'll explain that more. This is the idea of how many people we need. The goal is to feel a role, which means we contribute. To belong, you have to be authentic. To be authentic, you have to belong. It's like a circuitry. You can't have one without the other. Okay? And love is a felt sense. Next slide. Wait, actually go back. That's a really important point. So why are we getting sick? The less time we're outside, the less time we're actually working with each other. Why is it we go to Burning Man and we suddenly feel so good? Mm-hmm. Because it's hard enough that we have to come together, but you know you can't contribute if you're not taking care of yourself first, right? Self-reliance first. But then once you're self-reliant, you're contributing. You have to contribute, and you feel so alive, and you're in flow, right? So it's that we're not getting the natural signals that light up parts of us where we don't feel whole. Next slide. So here's like the point, that pack of zebras are not saying everybody go left, right? They're feeling each other. That's why they can stay in coordination. That's the limbic system. That's the same system you feel when you feel love. That's why codependent love doesn't quite feel so good, right? Because it's actually your brainstem trying to regulate itself. It's not real flow, which is true reciprocity. Two independent people flowing with each other. Next slide. So, this book I read 20 years ago. This book came out a couple of years ago, which was really amazing to me, and also Sebastian Unger's book. What Harari talks about is how prior to, once we developed cognition, once the neocortex came online, storytelling is actually the next innovation in cooperation. It's the next innovation in coordination. Culture is what allowed us, thinking allowed us culture, and culture allowed us to tell stories. So I can say, Brad, before then I had to intimately know everybody in a felt way, right? But now I can say, okay, everybody under 5 feet tall, show up at 5 o'clock here. So now we can coordinate in larger numbers. It's kind of a cool thought, is because we really destroyed the earth, which is like the most selfish thing we did. But it was actually our increased capacity for cooperation because of thinking. But, and this is what the book Tribe talks about, there's really different ways of doing this. Our value systems can lead to very different outcomes in terms of how whole we feel, how fulfilled we are, and how healthy we are. And a big point he makes in there is if you look at the data, we actually do well under crises, like mental health rates, mental health usage in clinics actually dramatically dropped like after 9/11. If you look at it over and over again, after really difficult things, when people have to come together, we actually do better mental health-wise. Next slide. So, our heritage is to be in this interdependent state, cooperative, which is a felt sense, and we couldn't know more than maybe about 150 people is what our limbic system can actually know intimately. Intimately being a felt sense. But when we are intimate, when we belong, we can complete our emotions. So some of the best studies on psychotherapy show that regardless of the modality, if you feel that your therapist sincerely loves you, the therapy works.
Yes.
So why don't we teach each other how to really love? But we have to contribute. We have to give. And we're being bred to be selfish. This is the problem, right? Next slide. So in terms of mental and culture, which they're related, we are driven by narrative. You look at research on what drives human behavior, meaning and purpose are like, that's what drives us. Which means story, which means the idea of me matches my behavior and my experiences, okay? And then in the culture, what is it that we're valuing? What is it we're pursuing? Next slide. So the evolution of the mind-body disconnect. So once we developed cognition, that allowed us representational information, which meant we became conscious of ourselves. That, to me, is the story of the Garden of Eden. In the Torah, it says, once we ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is the ability to make judgments, which is a representational information, you will now rule the earth, but it will be the cause of your greatest suffering. Same in Buddhism, that it's our illusions that we try and avoid reality, and that causes us suffering, right? Pain versus suffering. So whether it's Eden, or whether it's Buddha nature, or whether it's the Tao, I think that's all describing this precognitive flow state. And then it's self-consciousness that creates this. So we begin to be able to control our emotions, which gives us the capacity to be creative, but it also can alienate us. It can be fulfilling, or it can cause emptiness. So we can, with our thinking, dissociate from our emotional, direct perception of reality. Next slide. So right from the beginning, we've had wisdom traditions that keep telling the same story. So my hope is, especially that brain slide, that the brain, we can now be elders where we use our information wisely, maturely. So we can use science as a wisdom tradition. I don't think we need more science to teach people how to love. I think we got to decide that we're going to do it, right? Next slide. So I call this the history of integrative practices. So whether it's the Sweat Lodge, Vision Quest, whether it's the Indians coming up with yoga, or the Chinese coming up with Tai Chi, or it's team sports, ever since then we are doing things to get into that flow state with each other, to integrate again. Next slide. So to use science as a wisdom tradition, I put these up there because this is Maslow's hierarchy. Does everybody know Maslow's hierarchy? If you look at it, it matches the brain. It's the physical at the bottom, relationships, and then it's conceptual up here. But you got to go this way. So the idea is, and if I could use the whiteboard, but that this is called bottom-up regulation. The idea that this regulates this and this regulates this. That this determines what you do, but this is how you experience the world. So when you spend a day doing everything on the list that you thought was going to be good, but you don't feel really kind of disconnected, right? But then you have other days that you did what you wanted to do, and you feel like, God, I could die tomorrow. What is that experience where everything is lit up, right? That's when you're honoring bottom-up regulation, where you're in flow, and then the ideas are in flow. What I like to do on the whiteboard is, and I do this with my clients, is then draw lines, like just, that's flow state. That's meaning. That's a state of meaningfulness. So the argument is wholeness is optimal health, optimal capacity to heal, and also self-actualization. What am I here to do creatively? This way. Next slide. Honoring that the core conflict of modern man is authenticity and belonging. So I explain to people, we know authenticity when we see a baby. We know authenticity when we go to some undeveloped countries and we say they're still so pure. How do we know that, right? It's a felt experience. It's in their body. They're not holding, right? That's how you know. It's the way, in infants, you don't hold on, don't hold back. So this was, the thing I'd said earlier, like, why do we stay stuck? Why do we hold on? Why do some people go through traumatic, why do some people go through terrorizing experiences and not get sick versus others don't? And it was this idea, I didn't put it up there, it's called the primary disconnect that Gabor Mate taught me, which is that in early infancy, early few years of your life, you have to fit in. Attachment trumps authenticity early in life. And if you, growing up in a family or a culture that too rigidly imposes a negation of some authentic part of yourself, you will suppress that in order to survive. You will literally hold on for dear life. So if you were walking in a supermarket and you suddenly don't see where your mom is, it's life or death when you're 3, 4 years old to fit in. Who do I need to be? If you're lucky, you're raised in a family or culture that allows that flexibility, and it's a healthy integrity environment, then you do suppress parts of yourself because you're trying to fit into something healthy that will honor your integrity ultimately. But what if 3 generations ago something terrible happened in my family and anger is suppressed? We don't talk about anger. Then I have to cut out anger. I remember when I learned this, I remembered how in high school, who's being authentic and who's not being authentic, being fake was the big thing, right? Mm. So what Gabor was saying is that initially we pretend. It's our ability to imagine that we create this persona. And we do it pretending, and we know we're pretending. But at some point we stop remembering that we were pretending. And I think it's when the neocortex really expands in early adolescence and the ability to really actually dissociate comes online. And that's what happens in adolescence. I think the people who are being fake are the ones that start believing the persona. Whereas before you let go, you know that we were pretending, right? So this is how the persona develops. Next slide. I was listening to Michael Mead recently. I don't know if people know him. He talks about tribal, indigenous practices and myth. And he referred to the first initiation into community is the development of the persona. And the persona is made up of both beliefs of who I am, like I'm a bad person if I get angry. I can't get angry because I'm moody. Or these people, we have these these narratives in our head of who we are, these things that we can't stop, these obsessive thoughts. These are these core beliefs. Now, core beliefs are all the things that govern us, but then there are some that play a role in terms of pathogenesis. And it's controlling through holding in the body. So the point is to not show that authentic felt expression of who I really am, that vulnerability. And it's a physical holding. Next slide. So false beliefs that we take on, like I'm too much, or I'm not enough, right? These ideas. They also tell a story. These are judgments of authentic feelings that we suppress, and they come from somewhere in our ancestry. So anybody who's, Paul, you know internal family systems.
Yeah.
Is that if you go back, at some point there was some major crisis, the Depression, a terrible child loss, famine, tidal wave, whatever it is, something major happened in which the family, in order to adapt and survive, over-controlled certain things. And then it gets passed on, right? And so this is another way in which healing can heal family, heal ancestry, heal society, is that we can start to regenerate our connection with our lineage and our heritage. Next slide. And holding in the body. These are physical suppression of impostures to not show. The activation has a survival intensity, becomes implicit memory, and then these behaviors and postures become habits over time. Next slide. So this is what would I call a psychogenic device that we use with our clients as a way for people to themselves see. So at the end of my assessment, when I give people feedback, I draw these circles for them to see the actual physical way it works. Is that and to point out, the authentic you is still in there, and all of the innate resilience is still in there, as well as, and I'll write in here, grief or trauma, right? Holding in the body, and then the persona. Next slide. So ideally, we have the hero's journey experience. You go through adolescence and you leave and you go out in the wild and you confront your fears and you push through. But if you live in a disintegrative culture, it leads to chronic dysregulation. So I use this idea of pica. The doctors, in the building, room know what pica might be. It's severe iron deficiency. So when people have severe iron deficiency, they will kind of go crazy and not know why, but they're like eating dirt and clay and anything without even knowing why. And it's like the body's attempt to try and get iron in their system. And I think that's what we are like right now. I think that's the 80% opiate use. I think that's all the over-medication. I think it's the workaholism, the prestigeaholism, the money obsession, all the addictions, is that we are starving to feel alive. Next slide. So the persona, we compartmentalize our feelings, we don't complete our emotions, unresolved grief and trauma. That leads to postures and dysregulated behavior and lifestyle, pain, chronic stress, and inflammation. Eventually, over time, that imbalance in the system leads to functional medicine imbalances, adrenal fatigue, gut inflammation, hormone imbalance. We have epidemics now in women of thyroid, hyperthyroidism, hypothyroidism, epidemics of autoimmune disease. Next. So coming back to the somatic theory of trauma, why? So you got the persona. If I can't get angry, and then now I go through something terrorizing, I stay in that frozen state. That's why me and my friend go through that terrorizing thing. He may not develop PTSD, but I do. Because I'm already set up to not complete my natural defensive actions. Next slide. So this becomes homeostasis. These are the people that I see every day who are treatment resistant. And each layer is suppression. So the persona is suppressing the authentic self. The addictions are trying to balance and help the person feel alive somehow, but mainly suppressing the authentic self. And then medicine, again, to suppress. So when I draw this out for my clients, I'm drawing arrows inward. It's all holding in. And why that's a problem is because the natural state is to keep growing. I've seen as many people hit crisis when something good happens as bad, actually. Because anything that puts pressure on the authentic self to grow will push the authentic self out bigger. Because that's the natural process as you grow. Next slide. So I can actually go back. I think this is the hero's journey. I think this describes what it is that it's that persona. And I like the circles because at that point I'll draw cracks. Right? I'll talk about how the cracks let in the light, that actually your symptoms is your health emerging. That's your authentic self trying to come out. But it's got a lot of shit it's got to say. Right? I think that the dark night of the soul is when the gap between the persona and the authentic self is so big, especially if you're dissociating, which is a really common thing that people don't recognize, how much dissociation there is. I think it's kind of like the chair gets knocked out under you so fast, and then the gap, and you kind of can't locate even the authentic self for a little while. So you lost the persona, but you're in the dark with where is the actual authentic me, because there's a lot of dissociation. Next slide. So, crisis brings out the best in us, the authentic self. Crisis is wholeness seeking itself. Because when you fall apart, you know you wind up knowing who you are. You know what you're actually good at and what you're not good at. You know who you're not. And you come to know that you need others. I've had somebody, I allow some of my clients to text me if they're going to have a panic attack or something in which they would normally do something. And I've had people 20 years of panic attacks, and the fact that they could actually call me in that moment and I could talk them through it. They never had a panic attack again. It was like that was the one thing they needed to do. Sometimes I think that's what's so amazing about ayahuasca is that it breaks you down. It's like so disabling, you know, and it just I know that it's much more than that, but that alone, I think, humbles you. I think that's why it is the grandmother.
Yeah.
And so you recognize that you're interdependent. You gain respect for nature, earth, the ecosystem. You know, you restore bottom-up regulation. You know you have to take care of yourself. You know you need relationships. I think the idea of suffering as grace comes from this. Is that when you have enough of a crisis, it breaks down self-consciousness and you restore flow state and wholeness. I think it's interesting, the idea of grace, because grace, we describe movement or speech as graceful, which is brainstem. So I think it's when you restore brainstem, the limbic system, the idea of you into one flow again. And I think when you get there, you have these, your perception opens, you have direct experience, and some people will experience a light, an energy, a warmth. I think that's because you've accessed that complete open state. Next slide. So this is how I think psychedelics can play a role, is if they see themselves alongside, you know, in a tradition. And to see themselves as an intervention, as a way in which we are evoking the innate capacity, our innate wholeness. It's not the elixir. We are the elixir. We are the thing. It's us. That's the goal. And you don't need psychedelics, but maybe that's going to help. So I think if you look at all interventions, they either are comforting you, suppressing you, or they're evoking something in you. In our model, we do this, and we do very, very little of this. But if we do this, we say we're doing that.
Right.
There's nothing wrong. Orthopedic doctors don't have a problem with the word crutch.
Right.
But I can't say crutch. No, I want to say crutch. It's a crutch. It's okay. We need crutches. We break things. Sometimes we're broken. If you can't go to work and pay my bill, that doesn't make sense. But we're going to call it what it is.
Right.
We're not going to tell millions of people for 30, 40 years you have a chemical imbalance. There's nothing you can do about it. You know, I've had people break down in tears when I said to them, you can recover from anxiety. He said, 5 years ago, the therapist said it's genetic. There's nothing I can do about it. He goes, and that's why I haven't been seeing you for the last 6 months. Because I feel like, what's the point? There's nothing I can do about it. Next slide. So it's the stories we're telling. Actually, back up. Because I was going to say one more. See, I wanted to say what this is like. That's why I put the tribe thing, because I think it's about values, and my argument is for us to be telling different stories, is that if we start to really see who we are, then when we're integration therapists, or we're helping people set intentions, or when we're listening to people's stories, it's not all about them. We're listening like the way you think of a plant or a car. You think of all the things that it needs to be well. And we're not afraid of preaching or being patriarchal to say, you need community, and that means you need to contribute. Because that's just what it is to be a mammal. You know, I love the book Tribe because it said, you know what? The Wall Street crook and the welfare crook are the same as far as the tribe is concerned. If you're not doing your part or you're taking too much, either way you get kicked out. That's brainstem. You got to take care of yourself first. And you have to contribute. Next slide, or two more. So we listen to all the data points, temperament, genetics, but we turn it into a story, and we really believe in telling meaningful, good stories. That means it's got to be real, it's got to address the real suffering, and it's got to be inspiring. But to be real, we need to say, two parents who weren't talking, and you couldn't tell if they were fighting or not, and you were 4 years old, that's fucking scary. For a mammal, that's really scary, and that's why it is trauma. Not because I'm saying it is, you have trauma symptoms, but nobody would look for it because the model is you have to have lost something much far worse, right? I just finished a book by a guy, Francis Weller, Wild Edge of Sorrow. He talks about the 5 gates of grief, that in our culture we only allow, first of all, we don't allow for much grief. There's something wrong if you're grieving too much. But we don't allow for grief beyond the loss of a loved one. We don't allow for grieving for the environment. We don't allow for grieving for where did the village go. The invisible elephant in the room. You know, that section, you know, people on our team know, like, we get to that section where it really eloquently describes that it's actually the invisible elephant in the room, is that we're designed for, like, many, many, many people around us. When we come home to these empty homes, 1 or 2 people, that is actually causing us tremendous grief, and we can't validate it because it's not in our construct that would actually be it. There's something wrong with me, right? So to really see a wholeness lens, you do an assessment in a very different way, and you do a formulation in a very different way, and you tell a very different story back to the person. And that story puts them in the story, and their recovery is not just about them. So, and I kind of try to coin this term, eco-mysticism, is that you go through that hero's journey, you suffer, you awaken to your innate purpose and potential, and in that journey you recognize all the things you actually are interdependent with, and then you suddenly realize, we need all this shit to continue. We need communities to continue. We need to change our values. We need to actually change society. Next slide. So I look at all the different things. Next slide. This is a repeat. Next slide. And we tell the story through this lens. We've set this enough. Next slide. Yeah. This is really important. If you look, this is brainstem, limbic, mental. What the contract is, this is your journey, not mine. I'm totally your coach. I will go all the way if you're running hard. It is reciprocal. My health is your health. I like to say, at this point, if on any given day my kid's school could be shot up, then it actually is true at this point. We're so sick at this point that, I really do care. It matters if you get better. And I need you to get better. We are in this together. And that means I have boundaries and I can say things. It's real. And you need to be creative. You need to be creative for yourself. You have a gift. You have something. Even if it's a smile, right? Create. And then the team development, we often, as we're talking about cases, will say, we're trying to get somebody to try something different. It's who are you to this person? I think you're an auntie, you're a cousin. You're a brother, you're a parent. But it's really extending that out. I tell the stories, I went through, anybody who's a therapist, you're trained if a kid and a mom are too connected, they're enmeshed, right? So I did my training in San Francisco, and I grew up in a really big Iranian Jewish community, 30, 40 people together on Friday nights. But then I lived away for 8, 9 years, and that was great. That I learned individualism and autonomy, and saw the too much belonging, and it can, But so when I moved back to LA, I was working with this young Iranian teenager. And you could tell his anxiety is because his mom and dad are really struggling. And I was waiting for the perfect time to make that comment and say, I think you're worrying, you're anxious because of your mom. And back then, this was before I did all my training. And it was that was an interpretation of his pathology. And I loved it because he looked at me and goes, of course. It's my mom and dad are suffering. Yeah. So now it's let's bring the mom and dad in. Let's get everybody in. And if you're not doing, nobody wants to do family therapy because you're afraid of saying there's something wrong with your family. But if you switch the lens that this whole way in which we're living is not well, that you too are suffering trying to uphold a whole village all by yourself. And where did your suffering come from? And the whole point is to promote health, not to find problems. You can talk to families about anything. Next. So, first stage was acute stabilization. Next stage is transformation, looking at different levels of the person. These come from, there's a lot of studies done on what programs or what are the ingredients in programs where people successfully go through transformation, meaning that they sustain the changes. And the three most important are that they do instill some daily mind-body practice, that they are doing that they feel that their change is part of some community, and that it has a purpose beyond the self. Which I love because, again, it's the brainstem is getting a daily stabilization. You're addressing the limbic system and the neocortex. Next. So we first work at the level of the brainstem, which means healing trauma, building emotional regulation, correcting functional system imbalances, and also addressing how they're living, lifestyle. This is all lifestyle. So this is the beginning. This is first. The next, not that we do one and then we don't do the other, but you can't heal relationships if you're not balanced. Next slide. And then capacity for relationships, both this is the teaching how to love, and this is actually your community. what is going on in terms of real relationships in your life. Next. And then we do a lot of work on values clarification. I call it soul-centric or wholeness-based, but it's that idea of like, there are values that work with human nature and there are values that don't work with human nature. And I think, material success only gets you so happy, tons of research on it, Japan studied it beyond a certain amount, so I can talk about that, just like a cardiologist can talk about cholesterol, right? It's like, you want to be well, this is what it looks like, this is human nature, right? And we work on ancestry, and then this is where psychedelics can play a role, is when people needed to see things in a different way. Next. And then integration is the third stage where we're really looking at building a new sustained health. And next slide. This is something we are going to roll out in the next month at Lameda, which is the first version of the model for general public, so not for like a person comes to the clinic. And so the same model, but done through council format, like I was saying earlier. And the idea is you come in, you join a council, you meet regularly, depends on whether it's weekly or monthly or quarterly, depends on the need and your choice. But you each first check in, how am I doing regulating myself? Then you check in, how am I doing in my relationships? Am I being myself? Am I being there for others? Am I experiencing real love and fulfillment? And if not, then we talk about it. And then, am I being creative? Do I have a vision? What is my vision? So the idea is like, it starts with bottom-up regulation and wholeness in community, holding each other to integrity of that model, but then it turns into a mastermind at that point. Because the creative component, then we work like a mastermind. So the check-in is like 2 to 3 minutes each person, and you'd be surprised, week after week, or 4 or 5 councils down, that 2 minutes, just having to show up in community with the same people and report, am I really doing my daily meditation? Am I using pot actually to regulate myself? Am I really being, like me and my wife are actually not talking that much. It's like just to report, you become accountable, and that's what community is. It's what happened when we went from 150 to more people that you can hide. So I think that's what's so powerful about the idea of council. It's just creating integrity with each other, right? So it's 2 to 3 minutes of checking in, and then the rest of the hour, hour and a half functions like a mastermind, actually. But the goal of the mastermind is to support our wholeness, which is our community and society's wholeness, right? And I think, at some point, like, I could see psychedelics being used. Of course, they can be by anybody, but, maybe the group would want to do it together. Next slide. And again, the project of McKinley, I just wanted to show one more thing. Next slide. Is that the entire institutional transformation is built on that same bottom up. So this is the physical, and then this is the vision, neocortex, values governing. I think that's the last slide. Next slide. That's it. That's a repeat. That's it.
Fantastic.
We have about 30 minutes for questions, so questions?
People have questions.
You cracked the code. Wow.
Fantastic talk. Very inspiring. Very inspiring. So the big question is, when? Put me on the list for the council.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've been doing it in our clinic for like a year now, and then we're gonna do a pilot with all the staff, all the yoga teachers and the frontline staff in March and April. And I think May, June, probably June, July, I always go too fast. June, July, we would do the first one for the public. Yeah, but we're doing, do people know James Maskell's Evolution of Medicine group? So we're gonna work with network of maybe about 150 health caregivers in North Hollywood, Valley Village, Studio City, to get them on board around healthcare practitioners committing to the council and this idea called the Integrative Health Alliance, which is like a pledge that all healthcare providers pledge to always educate and teach based on wholeness and prevention before any intervention that you would be dependent on, and to kind of honor human nature. So Harari's second book, see, I think the council's like a big deal because Harari's second book, Homo Deus, anybody read that one? You know, I think he's right. Like we're on the verge of creating a new species, and he points to my fields, psychoactive medications suppressing our feelings as one of the three main things that's part of changing us as a species, and then merging with technology. So I think this issue of what is human nature, that's why I'm so into the idea of human nature. Not only is it why we're getting so sick, but it's like what he calls a disembarkation point. We're now kind of about to go all the way, which is to completely disconnect from felt sense. And I think that's why human nature is like something to preserve and call it what it is, you know, which is bottom up. I mean, entertainment is great, but the overstimulating nature of culture is because we need to constantly get a hit, otherwise we feel the emptiness.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yes.
I thought it was a great presentation. Thank you so much. That was really good.
I'm glad you were here.
I am too. Thanks. Could you talk briefly about how you apply this to people who are stuck or dependent upon substances?
Yeah.
Thinking particularly of opiates.
You know, I don't work with severe addiction. I don't. Lori, who's here, is our addiction person, and maybe you could answer that. But we don't work with severe addiction. I mean,
Yeah, so
that's
if I'm I'm the addiction specialist, so when I'm working with people that they need to have some type of stability, you know, otherwise it would be in treatment. We do an outpatient, intensive outpatient programming if we're working with them, so it's more of working with the addictive behaviors, the self-regulation, the trauma that's in the body that they're using to try to self-medicate and regulate through or for. So, but anything that if they're not in some type of stabilization, if you will, you know, they're functioning, because it needs to be an outpatient program. Otherwise, we would advise some type of treatment center, which hopefully is interpersonal psychology, you know,
Yeah.
whole foods, you know, trauma-informed and all that kind of stuff.
yeah. I mean, what I would say, thanks, Lori. What I would say is not that it's different. It's just that we don't have the infrastructure.
Yeah.
With addiction, you need more infrastructure. We haven't built that program. And I think if I built that program, I would still believe in all the same principles, but I would then look at them in terms of how would this best play out. Like with the foster care at McKinley, it's a whole. We're not just putting our model there. We took our principles and we've spent a whole year trying to figure out how does these principles play out here. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. But I think it's based on like I think it's based on what is. I do think I cracked the code, so I think it will work. I just need the infrastructure.
Thank you so much. This was amazing.
Yeah.
I just spent the last 6 months working at a group home for foster girls who were pregnant or parenting. And just getting out of that, it was so exciting to see that you're taking this into that environment. And I'm wondering if there are any, like if you yourself, or are there any organizations that are trying to advocate this model, like to the foster care system as a whole? Like, is there anyone that's going around being like, well, let's move in this direction, like the kids?
Yeah. Well, we are creating a nonprofit actually, like literally in the next few weeks. And the idea is to this whole idea of mental health and the whole paradigm. You can see this is like a whole paradigm shift. It's actually completely telling the story differently. And then because of that, honoring other ancient modalities, honoring neuroscience, what we're doing at McKinley, my hope is it's going to be scalable. I think it's designed, we custom designed it for that, but then we saw as we're designing, we're like, this is something that can be implemented anywhere. Like the council format and the bottom-up regulation is so powerful, and then if you just put in every day yoga and breath work, just hammer away at the brainstem in terms of self-regulation and healing trauma, but then the council format. And so that's the hope.
What's the name of your nonprofit?
We haven't figured out.
Okay.
Just to reinforce, could I ask you to really just succinctly summarize the bottom-up regulation concept?
The idea is that when I said this is the brain, this is the spine, my wrist is the brainstem, my thumb is the limbic system, and then this is the neocortex. That regulation happens this way. Because the brainstem is fastest, but it actually arcs. Okay? Does that make sense? Because of creativity, it can go any which way. Because we can create illusions, like I don't need anybody. Meanwhile, the limbic system is hanging out, looking for its signals, right? So honoring bottom up is that creativity only has integrity if it's flowing, if you're in flow. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's honoring human nature, I think. That's what I take away from it. He comes out of, Bruce Perry coined this term, and he comes out of foster care work, and his whole point is, what he's hammering away at is that we're doing these top-down therapies, sitting with kids with really severe trauma, and if you're not regulated in your brainstem, you can't connect.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're not regulated in your brainstem, you can't think and learn anything new. So that's where he comes from. But I take it with wholeness, and I love drawing it. It's like all the line, because I think that's a peak state, is when you're really in flow, and then out here is story. And where the story of who you are, the vision you have for who you are, which is in alignment with the relationships who literally serve you, not all your Facebook friends who say that's awesome because you posted I did something amazing, but you actually literally felt, and feel others in a reciprocal shared experience day to day. You have family. So, that makes sense? And I think it's really cool because if you line it up, it's just all the wisdom, like the pillars of Buddhism and yoga, like Sangha, Asana, Dharma. Same thing. Asana is brainstem, Sangha is community, Dharma is creativity, is right? One of the oldest Jewish quotes is that the world is based on truth, peace, and love. Maslow's hierarchy. So I think that's the code. It's like, there it is, it's your brain.
Stephen Porges talks a lot about music as one way to kind of relate and connect limbically, I think, as a practice. Do you see music as a big part of this, maybe drumming, for example?
Yeah.
Or,
because I think those
like
rhythms down-regulate your brainstem. And then you can connect. Like rhythm, it's rhythm because it's in rhythm with something we recognize as rhythm. Where we get that rhythm is in nature. And so I think it brings us into those rhythms in which we naturally connect. And that's why I think drumming and song circles are like the most ancient medicines, actually, is because I love song circles because or singing, if you're participating, you know if you're being authentic. You know if you're holding back. You know if you're really giving it your all. You know and your group knows if you're going to take over. So I think song circles are one of those most ancient forms of medicine because it really works at that authenticity and belonging where your mind, it clarifies. Am I trying to go it alone or pretend, Same with drumming,
Yeah, I'm thinking like the interplay when you're doing group drumming between people.
Yeah.
You're keeping in
can't be in your head.
And not, showing off or, taking over too much, the same kind of thing.
Have you ever heard of an organization, actually it's an intentional community in Illinois called Generations of Hope?
No.
They formed a community about 13 years ago for the purpose of fostering and adopting sibling sets as a community, and they've replicated it 6 times, I think. So over the last couple of years, I've been in the preliminary stages of developing something like that for here, but it sounds like it's such a good fit for what you're doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a wish to do that with like aged out kids is a farm.
Well, it's the most vulnerable people among us are foster kids in sibling sets of like an LGBTQ kid there or a special needs kid. They almost never get permanent. So I figured I'd start with them. But this is the perfect system. Amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
I'm curious to hear more about when you work with children and how this information lands with them, and that you have to adjust the approach in terms of how you work with them as opposed to adults.
Depends. If with teenagers it lands really well because they're living that authenticity thing, and they're really living that culture values thing. They're really feeling the emptiness of how we are living. With smaller kids, you're dealing with the parents, and that's hard. I tell you, like, honestly, I think I would say only about half the people who do an assessment with me stick it out. But then the ones that stick it out, I would say 80-90% are completely recovered within 6 months to a year. Lori, would you agree? I mean, if you go through it, it's just, are you really willing to actually look and go, okay, I gotta change my life, I gotta look at my ancestry, I gotta be responsible.
And part of my policy is, and I think with Omid as well, is that we're not gonna just work with the kid. It's a family system. And we're dealing with co-regulation and all of that, and so you need, the buy-in the parent can bring the child, that's the buy-in. Oh wait, you want me to look at me? And then that's where you have to kind of work with that. So.
I have just one sentence, which is, this is how we can afford Medicaid for all.
Yeah.
If this is in the institutional medical system, then healthcare will become affordable because most people will get sick.
You gotta take care of yourselves and each other. You gotta weather the relationships. I had friends who their mom moved in with them. They said it took a year, but then after that year they were like, this is amazing. But like, we have to really detox from like our personal, all the illusions that we create. Yeah, I agree, yeah.
Yeah, this might be similar to the music question, but I'm curious your thoughts on storytelling. You talk about storytelling, and I hear about like the implicit stories we're telling, but the explicit stories we're telling seem to be constant in terms of like, even just the entertainment culture and what's presented, the stories we tell ourselves as a culture. Do you have any? I'm curious your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, the hero has changed, and I'm smarter, and it's like that's the winner,
Persona as shield.
Yeah.
And glorifying the function of the prefrontal cortex.
Glorifying the persona, yeah, that is. It's glorifying that no one's going to get in. That, yeah.
And also that you're cutting. You're cynical because you're using this part of your mind that can cut things, dissect them, analyze.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you see what would be your remedy in that sort of realm as a cultural prescription? Or is that a
big
piece?
question. I would sit for a whole week if I had that power. Yeah.
Are you saying what stories to tell? Like what should you?
I guess, or as I heard the speech, these are things that as society, ideally, like we
I
it
would
begins
love to, yeah, I would love to, I'm gonna get on me. I would love to have that influence. I mean, Louise knows, I've never turned anybody away in our clinic because of cost. But we see like really major stars, and I fantasize about creating a council with them of like changing Hollywood, like because I think we create culture, yeah, yeah, and I think the idea of human nature is like a real thing to preserve. Everybody went to Burning Man this year, it was like heavy, man.
Are you currently using any plant medicines in this wonderful model, and can you also address what you envision for the future as things become taken off Schedule 1, how it might be integrated into the model, like MDMA and LSD and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, we use ketamine, not as much as Cole, definitely not as much as you. There's underground people that we sometimes work with, but see, my thing is my clinic so far has been, people think of an integrative clinic, most integrative clinics are boutique clinics. I've always been like the person of last resort. I deal with treatment-resistant people. So I deal mostly with people who the crisis has already set in. And that's when they're ready to change. So I also haven't had that much need, but we've used ketamine, for instance, and it's been really huge factor in their change. Huge. I would love to use psilocybin. I would love to use ayahuasca. I think I would love to work with ayahuasca.
What about cannabis now that it's legal?
I don't know.
Pretty amazing.
I get too high with cannabis. I know, I've thought about that.
I had a pretty incredible breakthrough that was on par with MDMA-assisted psychotherapy with a blood dose of cannabis.
Yeah.
So it's pretty exciting because you could probably do it now.
And what I saw in Arizona was amazing. It was different from MDMA treatment of trauma, but it was extremely powerful. Really, I'd love to get your impression of it.
Just cannabis.
Yeah, something.
As an adjunct assisted psychotherapy.
Yeah.
Where can we see how they're doing that?
I think they're going to be putting it up on YouTube or something. It's still going on now. Today's the last day of the conference, so I know how long it's going to take. But it was really impressive. I'll put it on lamps when it comes out.
I used cannabis for a while to deliberately trigger anxiety because I would get anxious on it. And since it's, you can moderate the dosage and it doesn't last so long, it's not too intense, I was able to learn how to regulate. It took a year or so to really work with that. Yeah, so it was just another way to work with.
Can you say a little bit more about the work you've done, like maybe a case example or something?
Yeah, I mean, I probably used ketamine maybe with 20 patients, not that many. I've used psychedelics more than my client. But, I've seen, I work with story a lot. And with ketamine, I've done the injection, IM method, and then integration the second hour. And with the two people I've seen the biggest difference with, the journeys were not that, the pharmacological effect made a huge difference. Gave them space, but they both were gonna come back, and it was like in that second hour, that afterglow was like hammering home a story of change. And like one of them, it was like values clarification with both of them.
Yeah.
One guy was a gay Mormon guy who so much self-loathing, and like 30, 40 years of tons of medication, therapy. He was a meth addict, and the ketamine was what change them. Yeah.
Have any of them had mystical experiences, or do you use a lower dose?
No, they all go. They were all had doses high enough to have mystical experiences. But yeah.
Well, first wanted to echo what everyone's saying. All the ideas you've threaded together to create this program is phenomenal. Yeah, you're doing something unique and amazing, and you should be very proud. I was wondering if you're doing anything with rites of passage.
You mean out in like with other organizations?
I mean, wouldn't necessarily
doing
need to
it
be just built into your program for youth to, pass
Oh, with
tests
youth.
of various kinds.
Yeah, I mean, I would love to have a program like that. Yeah. If you want to find funding, I'd love to do addiction. I'd love to have a youth program. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, I think it would be great.
And it just dovetails so well with everything you're talking about. One of the huge things we're missing in our culture are those rites of passage and those ownership of responsibility. And I would love to see it one day.
Yeah. There's a place doing really good work like that, Pacific Quest in Hawaii.
Familiar.
Yeah, Pacific Quest. Okay.
I just have another quick question. Is this all this is sort of anxiety / depression related, or
Depression, anxiety, PTSD.
okay? So like
And bipolar
personality disorders.
I would say that's kind of like addiction. I would say personality disorder is like an addiction at the level of the brain. It's like it's an entrenched. So you need the right infrastructure. So with like borderline personality, it's actually the same model. I mean, this is very much DBT, but I don't work with a lot of I do work with people with borderline personality, but to like really more severe ones, you would need a DBT team, and so it's just that infrastructure. You need the right infrastructure. You did another question first.
I did.
I
I'm
answered.
greedy. Yeah.
No.
The stories we're talking about. Yeah. Explicit and implicit stories.
Yes.
You work with bipolar.
That's what I was going to say. That's something I'm really proud of. I mean, I'm proud of all of it. But I have bipolar disorder too. I've seen people get into full remission who had, because it is a predisposition. It is a genetic predisposition. It is a real, physiological. But I would say it's like a seizure, But I have seen if you address the whole person, and you really teach them self-regulation and lifestyle. And then there are some supplements that really help. I have had a number of people. I've had a number of people diagnosed with schizophrenia that were trauma and dissociation. And it wasn't schizophrenia. And that's sad, first of all, in terms of how a diagnosis just gets tacked on and then people just continue it. But trauma is the root cause. That's the root cause, is trauma and disconnection from self, and then not hearing the signals and the lifestyle and all that. That's the chunk of it. Yeah.
What supplements what have you worked with for people that are bipolar?
Like inositol is really good for people with bipolar disorder. And high dose magnesium. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.